11. Practical ways to rest your brain that refuses to stop overthinking. There's a reason your brain feels exhausted, even when your body is still. It's because thinking has become your default state, a constant hum in the background of your existence. You lie down to rest, but your thoughts don't. They replay conversations, invent scenarios, and run endless simulations of what could go wrong. You tell yourself you're solving problems, but deep down you know you're just trying to feel safe. Overthinking isn't analysis. It's self-defense disguised as control. Your brain, biologically, was never built for this kind of non-stop activity. It evolved for rhythm, moments of deep engagement followed by moments of restoration. Every time you resist rest to keep figuring things out, you disrupt that rhythm. The prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for decision-making and focus, starts to overheat. Cortisol rises, dopamine drops, and clarity disappears. The more you think, the less you see. You begin to chase answers in the very place your exhaustion was born. Neuroscientist Andrew Huberman explains that the brain is a prediction machine. It runs simulations to anticipate outcomes and ensure safety. But when stress hijacks that mechanism, it becomes obsessive. It no longer predicts, it catastrophizes. The nervous system gets stuck in a loop, feeding on its own adrenaline, unable to distinguish between a real threat and a remembered one. That's why you can feel physically tired after a day spent doing nothing. Your brain has been sprinting in circles. Jordan Peterson once said that the mind becomes chaotic when it loses structure. Overthinking is a symptom of a mind trying to create certainty where none exists. You replay, revise, rethink, because somewhere inside, you believe if you just think long enough, you'll find peace. But the truth is inverted. Peace doesn't come after thinking stops. Thinking stops after peace returns. Your brain doesn't need more control. It needs recovery. Daniel Goleman's research on emotional intelligence reveals that overthinking is not a mental problem. It's an emotional one. The intellect tries to do the job of the body, using logic to manage feelings it refuses to feel. When you suppress emotion, the brain compensates by overanalyzing. That's why you can't think your way out of anxiety, because the anxiety isn't in your mind, it's in your nervous system. The body is whispering, "I need rest," and the mind answers, "Let me think about it." But there's a way out, not through distraction, but through deliberate restoration. Neuroscience calls it cognitive rest. It's not sleep, it's not meditation in the traditional sense. It's a conscious release of mental tension, a recalibration of the brain's rhythm. When you rest intentionally, dopamine levels stabilize, serotonin restores mood balance, and GABA, the neurotransmitter of calm, begins to quiet the inner noise. The overactive mind learns, finally, to breathe. This video isn't about escaping your thoughts. It's about retraining your brain to stop mistaking rest for danger. You'll learn practical, science-backed ways to calm an overthinking mind, not by forcing silence, but by restoring the brain's natural balance between focus and stillness. Because the truth is simple, your brain doesn't need more stimulation. It needs permission to stop. You've spent years trying to outthink your exhaustion. Now it's time to outrest it. The invisible fatigue, when thinking becomes an addiction. There's a kind of exhaustion that no amount of sleep can fix. The fatigue that comes from a brain that never stops rehearsing life. It's invisible because it hides behind activity. You look productive, responsible, even intelligent. But beneath that surface, your mind is running like a machine that's forgotten the meaning of off. This isn't focus, it's dependency. You've become addicted to thinking, not because you love it, but because it keeps you from feeling. From a neuroscientific view, the brain becomes addicted to its own chemistry. Each cycle of thought releases dopamine, the molecule that signals pursuit. It doesn't matter what you're chasing, a solution, control, closure, the brain rewards the chase itself. Over time, that loop becomes self-reinforcing. The more you think, the more dopamine you release, and the more you crave the next thought. This is why silence feels unbearable to chronic overthinkers. Not because it's empty, but because it lacks the stimulation the brain has learned to depend on. Andrew Huberman explains that dopamine drives anticipation, not satisfaction. It keeps you moving forward, searching for the next piece of information that might make you feel at ease. But there's no end point. The very act of chasing peace keeps it out of reach. Cortisol rises with every unresolved thought, and your nervous system interprets your own mind as a source of threat. That's why lying in bed at night can feel like standing in traffic. Your body is still, but your brain believes it's in danger. Psychologically, this addiction to thinking is a defense mechanism. Jordan Peterson would say it's the mind's attempt to impose order on chaos. The brain tries to control the unpredictable by analyzing every possible outcome. The problem is that life doesn't submit to analysis. The more you try to think your way into safety, the more anxious you become, because thought can't provide what only trust and rest can restore. Overthinking is the intellect's rebellion against uncertainty, but uncertainty is not an enemy. It's the birthplace of growth. Daniel Goleman's studies on attention show that the brain consumes enormous energy maintaining high cognitive load. When you don't allow mental rest, glucose, the brain's primary fuel, depletes rapidly. That depletion triggers frustration, irritability, and impulsive behavior. Your body is signaling enough, but your mind insists on more. The fatigue becomes self-perpetuating. The more tired you are, the less control you have over the compulsion to think, and the deeper the exhaustion grows. Philosophically, René Descartes sought clarity through thought, but even he warned that reason without reflection becomes illusion. When you identify entirely with your mind, you mistake noise for intelligence. The Stoics understood this centuries before neuroscience did. Marcus Aurelius wrote that tranquility comes not from thinking less, but from thinking rightly, and that right thinking begins with silence. It's not thought itself that drains you. It's the inability to stop feeding it. To begin breaking the addiction, you must treat overthinking as you would any other dependency, through awareness and replacement, not resistance. The first step is to recognize when you're thinking to avoid feeling. Notice how your body reacts, the tension in your shoulders, the tightness in your chest, the shallow breathing. Those sensations are your nervous system pleading for rest. The goal isn't to suppress thought, but to redirect your attention from mental loops to physical grounding, what Huberman calls state control. Each time you interrupt the loop, even for a few seconds, your brain begins to relearn safety in stillness. GABA, the neurotransmitter responsible for calm, starts to rise. Serotonin stabilizes mood. You begin to realize that you don't need to think your way out of everything, because not every moment requires your mind to solve it. The fatigue you feel isn't weakness, it's feedback. It's your brain asking for the rhythm it was designed for: focus, then release. Work, then stillness. Effort, then surrender. The path to clarity isn't through more control, it's through restoration. The brain rests not by stopping thoughts, but by remembering it doesn't have to chase them all. The myth of productivity and the cult of constant thinking. We live in a culture that glorifies exhaustion. The more tired you are, the more worthy you feel. The more you think, the smarter you seem. Productivity has become the new morality, and silence the new sin. We call it ambition, but beneath it lies fear. Fear of stillness, fear of uselessness, fear of being left behind. The modern mind doesn't rest because it's been trained to equate rest with failure. Every pause feels like losing ground. Every quiet moment feels like a threat to your value. But this is a psychological illusion. Neuroscience proves that the brain does not grow through constant stimulation. It strengthens through rhythm, cycles of effort and recovery. Andrew Huberman calls this the ultradian rhythm, a natural pattern of roughly 90 minutes of focused energy followed by 20 minutes of rest. When you ignore this rhythm, cortisol floods your system and the neural circuits responsible for focus begin to fatigue. You start mistaking agitation for productivity. You're busy but not effective, alert but not clear. Daniel Goleman describes this as the attention economy, the endless competition for mental bandwidth. The more you think, the less you notice what you're thinking about. Overthinking turns focus into fragmentation. You're not managing your mind, you're multitasking your anxiety. Each task, each thought, each worry competes for dopamine, and the brain, designed for selective focus, becomes overwhelmed. This constant cognitive noise drowns out insight. The very effort to stay sharp dulls the mind. Philosophically, Aristotle warned of this trap long before neuroscience existed. He taught that contemplation without balance leads to distortion, that wisdom requires leisure, not as laziness, but as space for the soul to think clearly. The Stoics echoed this truth. The mind that never pauses loses perspective. Marcus Aurelius wrote that even the sun seems to stand still as it rises, because movement without direction is chaos. The same applies to thought. When your mind runs without rest, you confuse motion for meaning. The cult of constant thinking sells you the illusion of control. It tells you that if you can just analyze enough, predict enough, or plan enough, you'll be safe. But what you're really doing is feeding your stress response. Each thought triggers the release of adrenaline, keeping your body in a low-grade state of emergency. This is why, even when you're sitting quietly, your heart feels restless and your body tense. You've trained your biology to interpret stillness as danger. Cognitive behavioral therapy offers a radical reframe. What you call productivity is often just avoidance in disguise. The need to stay mentally active is the mind's strategy to outrun discomfort. It's easier to drown in activity than to face uncertainty. But true productivity, the kind that creates, not consumes, comes from clarity, not chaos. To access that, your brain needs downtime. During rest, the default mode network integrates memory, emotion, and learning. This is when new ideas emerge, when creativity sparks, when solutions reveal themselves unforced. Joe Dispenza often reminds us that the brain is both architect and prisoner of its patterns. When you're always thinking, you reinforce the same neural pathways that created your exhaustion. You strengthen the addiction to control. Breaking free begins with permission, the courage to stop mistaking stillness for laziness. Neuroscience confirms that deliberate rest enhances cognitive flexibility, creativity, and emotional regulation. In other words, stepping back isn't wasting time, it's multiplying it. The most powerful minds throughout history, from Descartes to Einstein, understood this paradox. Descartes found clarity not in constant analysis, but in retreating from noise to observe the mechanism of his own mind. Einstein discovered relativity while daydreaming. Rest is not withdrawal from thought, it's the restoration of thinking itself. So the question is not how much more you can do, but how much you're willing to undo. The brain that refuses to rest isn't powerful, it's trapped. The mind that learns to pause doesn't lose its edge, it sharpens it. Because the sharpest thoughts come not from pressure, but from presence. Cognitive overheating, the science of a tired brain. The human brain is a masterpiece of energy efficiency, until you overuse it. Thinking feels effortless, but biologically, it's one of the most demanding activities your body performs. Every thought consumes glucose, oxygen, and neurotransmitters. The prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for reasoning, planning, and focus, burns through this fuel faster than any other part of the brain. When you never stop thinking, your brain doesn't just get tired metaphorically, it literally overheats. You are forcing the most complex organ on Earth to run without pause, expecting it to produce clarity while drowning in its own noise. Neuroscientifically, this state is known as cognitive fatigue. When the prefrontal cortex is overworked, its efficiency collapses. Decision-making deteriorates, emotional control weakens, you start reacting instead of reasoning. The amygdala, your emotional alarm system, takes over. This is why, after a long day of mental strain, small problems feel catastrophic. The brain's chemistry shifts. Dopamine, which fuels motivation, plummets. Serotonin, which stabilizes mood, becomes erratic. Cortisol surges to compensate. You interpret this chemical imbalance as anxiety or frustration, but it's simply your biology crying out for rest. Andrew Huberman explains that the brain alternates between two states, focus and defocus. Sustained concentration is like holding your breath, powerful in short bursts, but destructive if prolonged. When you ignore the natural rhythm of focus and release, neural pathways begin to misfire. The reward system stops distinguishing between productive effort and mere busyness. You keep thinking not because it's useful, but because your nervous system is stuck in overdrive. Cognitive overheating isn't mental weakness, it's neural overload. Psychologically, overthinking mimics addiction. It gives a false sense of control and temporary relief from discomfort, but it comes at a cost. Each time you indulge in mental spiraling, you reinforce the same neural circuit responsible for worry. Over time, this circuit becomes the brain's default mode, the autopilot of anxiety. This is why it's so hard to stop thinking even when you want to. The mind has built a habit of mental tension. Cognitive behavioral therapy teaches that this habit can only be broken by creating new associations, by linking calm, not chaos, with safety. Aristotle once said that virtue lies in the balance between extremes. The same applies to thought. Too little reflection breeds ignorance. Too much breeds paralysis. The Stoics practiced mental stillness not as detachment, but as strategy. They understood that the mind cannot act wisely when it's inflamed. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the greatest strength is a mind unmoved by excess. In modern terms, this means a brain that knows when to engage and when to step back. Joe Dispenza's research on neuroplasticity adds another dimension. When you stay in a prolonged state of mental stress, your brain's electrical patterns become rigid. The same thoughts produce the same emotions, which reinforce the same physiology. You become biologically trapped in repetition. But the opposite is also true. When you deliberately introduce calm through breathing, grounding, or intentional pauses, your brain waves slow from high-frequency beta, associated with stress, to alpha, associated with relaxed alertness. This shift allows neurons to recover, restore energy, and form new, healthier connections. Cognitive overheating isn't a sign that you're failing. It's evidence that your brain has been loyal beyond its limits. It has tried to protect you through control, to keep you safe through vigilance, to manage chaos by never turning off. But clarity doesn't emerge from tension. It emerges from rhythm, the alternation between effort and ease. When you give your brain permission to rest, you're not losing time. You're regaining intelligence. The brain doesn't burn out because it's weak. It burns out because it's powerful, and power without rhythm always collapses under its own intensity. The rest reflex, how the brain heals when you stop forcing it. The human brain is designed for rhythm, not resistance. Just as your lungs expand and contract and your heart beats and rests, your mind too has a natural pulse, cycles of focus, followed by surrender. But in a world obsessed with control, you've trained yourself to override that rhythm. You force concentration beyond its limit. You push clarity through fatigue. You demand silence through tension. The more you force the mind to rest, the louder it resists. True mental restoration doesn't come from suppression. It comes from surrender, from allowing the brain to return to its natural flow. Neuroscience has a term for this: the rest reflex. When you stop trying to solve and start allowing stillness, the default mode network activates, a group of interconnected regions responsible for introspection, creativity, and emotional integration. This is the brain's version of exhaling. During this state, neurons consolidate memory, organize information, and release accumulated mental waste through a process called synaptic pruning. Andrew Huberman often explains that rest is not the absence of brain activity, It's the reorganization of it. The mind doesn't go silent. It goes into repair mode. Psychologically, rest is a confrontation with your own unease. Overthinkers avoid rest not because they hate silence, but because silence reveals what constant thinking hides. The moment you stop analyzing, repressed emotions surface: fear, grief, shame, uncertainty. That's why rest feels uncomfortable at first. Your nervous system has confused calm with danger. But as you remain still, something profound happens. The body begins to regulate itself. Cortisol drops, dopamine resets. GABA, the neurotransmitter of peace, rises. The very chemicals that drove your mental noise begin to restore your mental quiet. Daniel Goleman's work on emotional intelligence highlights this process as recovery attention, the shift from problem-solving to awareness. When you rest, your perception expands. You see patterns, not details. You stop fighting thoughts and begin witnessing them. This shift from control to observation engages the prefrontal cortex in a different way, no longer as a commander, but as a witness. This is where insight is born. Some of your clearest thoughts appear not when you're thinking harder, but when you've stopped trying. Philosophically, Descartes sought truth through doubt, but he also understood the necessity of suspension, the moment when the mind stops imposing and starts perceiving. The Stoics, too, called this inner stillness, the discipline of letting reality unfold without interference. Marcus Aurelius wrote that tranquility is achieved not by escaping the world, but by aligning with its rhythm. Rest, then, is not withdrawal from effort. It's effort in harmony with nature. Joe Dispenza's studies on brain coherence reveal how this surrender changes your physiology. When brainwaves synchronize, when thought, emotion, and breath move in rhythm, energy efficiency increases dramatically. The heart rate stabilizes. The body shifts from survival mode to repair mode. You experience what neuroscientists call parasympathetic dominance, the biological signature of restoration. It's not mystical, it's measurable. The brain is healing itself through the absence of resistance. The paradox is this: the harder you try to rest, the less your mind can. The brain cannot recover under command, it recovers under permission. True rest begins the moment you stop performing peace and start allowing it. It's not about emptying the mind, but freeing it. Freeing it from the compulsion to think, from the pressure to solve, from the illusion that control equals safety. When you stop forcing the brain to rest, it remembers how to. It exhales, reorganizes, and returns to balance. In that state, thought becomes lighter, emotion becomes fluid, and clarity returns naturally. Not as a goal, but as the mind's original state. The stillness you keep chasing is not something you create. It's something you uncover. It's been there all along, waiting for you to stop interfering with it. The power of the cognitive pause. Your mind was not designed to move in straight lines. It's built in waves, bursts of focus followed by drops of attention, tension followed by release. The problem arises when you ignore those natural dips, forcing constant mental activity until the system collapses. What the brain needs most is not endless stimulation but interruption, what neuroscientists call the cognitive pause. A moment long enough for your nervous system to reset, for your chemistry to balance, and for clarity to return. The cognitive pause is not laziness, it's neural maintenance. Andrew Huberman often explains that short, deliberate pauses throughout the day can restore the brain's capacity for focus by lowering stress hormones and replenishing dopamine. One of the simplest techniques is what he calls the physiological sigh. 2 short inhales through the nose, followed by a slow exhale through the mouth. In less than a minute, this pattern signals the body to shift from the sympathetic fight or flight state to the parasympathetic rest and recover state. You can literally breathe your brain back into balance, but the pause is more than biology. It's philosophy in action. Descartes sought truth through observation, not reaction. The Stoics practiced the same principle, pausing before judgment to ensure reason not emotion, guided their decisions. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the space between impulse and response is where freedom lives. The cognitive pause is that space. When you insert it into your day, before speaking, deciding, or reacting, you reclaim authority over your mind. You're no longer a prisoner of momentum. You're a participant in awareness. Psychologically, this pause interrupts what Daniel Goleman calls the emotional hijack. When cortisol spikes and the amygdala takes control, your reasoning shuts down. That's why you say things you regret or make choices that contradict your values when stressed. A 5-second pause gives your prefrontal cortex time to re-engage. The difference between reacting impulsively and responding intelligently. Over time, this trains emotional regulation. You begin to trust your own calm more than your chaos. Cognitive behavioral therapy uses a similar mechanism called response prevention. When you feel the urge to analyze, worry, or fix, you consciously delay action for a few seconds. The brain expects to fall into the old loop, but when it doesn't, a new association begins to form: safety in stillness. The nervous system learns that nothing bad happens when you wait. This rewires anxiety at its core because fear feeds on immediacy. Delay starves it. Joe Dispenza's research expands this into the realm of neuroplasticity. Each pause you take is a micro-intervention, a moment where you stop reinforcing old neural pathways and begin building new ones. When repeated, these moments compound, creating an internal rhythm of rest inside your daily life. You no longer need long escapes to recover. Your calm becomes portable. You carry rest within you. The beauty of the cognitive pause lies in its simplicity. It requires no special skill, no meditation app, no ritual. You can practice it in traffic, in a conversation, in the middle of work. All it asks is awareness, a conscious decision to stop letting your mind dictate the tempo of your life. With every pause, your thoughts slow, your breath deepens, and your attention returns to the present moment. The brain, once addicted to constant motion, begins to rediscover its natural intelligence, clarity through rhythm. The pause is not empty time. It's the bridge between exhaustion and awareness. Each one is a small act of rebellion against the tyranny of mental noise, a reminder that the brain, when given space, doesn't lose power, it regains it. Reclaiming sensory awareness, the antidote to mental noise. The fastest way to quiet the mind is not by controlling thoughts, but by returning to the senses. Your brain cannot be fully trapped in overthinking and simultaneously anchored in the present moment. Sensory awareness, the simple act of feeling, seeing, hearing, and breathing consciously, is the antidote to mental chaos. It brings the mind back into the body, reconnecting cognition to the physical world. In that return, the noise begins to fade, not because you silenced it, but because you stopped feeding it. Neuroscience explains this beautifully. The brain's attention system works like a spotlight. It can only illuminate one domain fully at a time. When your focus shifts to direct sensory input, it withdraws energy from the networks responsible for internal rumination, such as the default mode network. Andrew Huberman emphasizes this in his studies of focus and visual anchoring. When you deliberately engage your senses, noticing light, sound, texture, or breath, your neural circuits for anxiety lose dominance. You stop analyzing, and you start perceiving. The present becomes louder than your thoughts. Psychologically, this is at the heart of cognitive behavioral therapy and mindfulness-based interventions. The mind races when it loses grounding. Overthinking is often the symptom of disconnection, from the body, from the environment, from now. Daniel Goleman calls this attentional fragmentation, attention splintered between past regret and future fear, never resting where life actually happens. Reclaiming sensory awareness reverses that fragmentation. You're training your attention to stabilize on what is real. Try this. Feel the weight of your body on the chair. Notice your breath entering and leaving through your nose. Hear the ambient sounds around you without labeling them. In less than 30 seconds, the speed of your thoughts slows. This isn't relaxation, it's recalibration. You are signaling to your nervous system that you are safe in the present moment. Cortisol levels drop, heart rate slows, and GABA, the neurotransmitter of calm, rises. The body, which was waiting for your mind to come home, begins to rest. Philosophically, this practice has ancient roots. Aristotle believed knowledge begins with the senses, that awareness of the world grounds all reasoning. The Stoics agreed. To see reality clearly, you must first see it as it is, not as your fears interpret it. Marcus Aurelius wrote that when the mind drifts into worry, it should return to what is before it: the air, the ground, the task at hand. Michel de Montaigne echoed this centuries later, observing that a person who can feel deeply the warmth of the sun or the weight of silence already possesses wisdom. Joe Dispenza's research bridges this with modern neuroplasticity. Each moment of sensory awareness strengthens neural pathways that associate peace with presence, not distraction. You're training the brain to equate stillness with safety. Over time, sensory grounding becomes instinctive. The mind learns that returning to the body is the fastest way to exit the storm. Reclaiming sensory awareness doesn't mean retreating from thought. It means balancing it. The intellect serves you best when it's rooted in perception. When you touch the world with your full attention, your brain aligns with its natural rhythm, focused yet calm, alert yet still. The world doesn't change when you practice this, but your perception of it does. The smallest details become alive again, and with them, your mind remembers what peace feels like in motion. The senses are not distractions from thought. They are the doorway out of it. When you live through them consciously, your mind finally stops searching for rest, because it's already found it, here, in this exact moment. The art of intentional boredom. You've been trained to avoid boredom like a virus. Every idle second is now filled. A scroll, a swipe, a video, a thought. But what if boredom isn't the enemy? What if it's the doorway your mind has been desperately waiting for, the gateway to true recovery and creative reawakening? Intentional boredom isn't passive or lazy. It's a deliberate mental space, a psychological detox from overstimulation, where your brain can finally breathe without pressure, perform without noise, and restore itself from the inside out. Neuroscience explains this through the lens of dopamine regulation. Every interaction with novelty, emails, notifications, even a new idea, causes a small dopamine release. The more frequent the stimulus, the more desensitized your receptors become. Over time, your brain craves constant stimulation, but it doesn't respond to it the same way. That's why you can be scrolling for hours and still feel restless. You're chasing a neurochemical high that your system can no longer produce. The solution isn't more novelty. It's dopamine recalibration, and boredom is the reset button. Studies by researchers like Jonathan Schooler and supported by Andrew Huberman's work on mind wandering and insight show that deliberate disengagement from tasks, especially in low-stimulation environments, activates the brain's default mode network, the very circuitry responsible for introspection, integration, and problem-solving. Ironically, your deepest clarity emerges when you stop trying to find it. Einstein often claimed his best ideas came not at the blackboard, but while walking slowly and thinking of nothing at all. Psychologically, this requires a new relationship with silence. Overthinkers often fear stillness because silence brings unresolved thoughts to the surface. But that's the point. In intentional boredom, you're not suppressing thoughts. You're letting them float to the top, where they can be seen, acknowledged, and released. Cognitive behavioral therapy emphasizes exposure and reframing. Face the discomfort of mental stillness, and over time, you retrain your brain to see it not as a threat, but as a space of power. Practically, this means creating micro-environments of boredom in your day. A 5-minute walk without your phone, sitting on your couch with nothing but breath and sound, or doing a simple repetitive task, like washing dishes or folding clothes, without layering it with music, podcasts, or news. These moments seem empty on the surface, but inside your brain, something profound is happening. Neuroplastic healing, emotional integration, the birth of clarity. Philosophically, the Stoics knew this well. Seneca warned that a life of constant motion is often a sign of internal disorder. He said, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a lot of it." Montaigne went further. "The greatest thing in the world is to know how to belong to oneself." Boredom, then, is not the absence of action. It is the presence of self. It is the place where you return to your own thoughts without needing to escape them. Joe Dispenza teaches that when we sit with our inner world, without distraction, we access the subconscious programming that drives most of our behaviors. In boredom, the ego dissolves a little. The noise fades. The brain stops chasing and starts listening. You remember that being is enough. Intentional boredom is a rebellion against the addiction to urgency. It's a reclaiming of your time, your chemistry, and your consciousness. When practiced regularly, it rewires your brain to stop seeing nothing happening as wasted time and start seeing it as the sacred soil where the mind regenerates. Emotional uncluttering, the link between overthinking and emotional suppression. Overthinking often masquerades as intelligence, but beneath its surface, it's rarely about logic. It's about emotion, suppressed, avoided, denied emotion. Most people don't realize that the mind races not because it's searching for answers, but because it's running from feelings it doesn't know how to process. Emotional clutter is the silent architect of mental noise. Until you face it, your brain won't rest, because it can't. Daniel Goleman's concept of emotional hijacking explains this beautifully. When a difficult feeling is not acknowledged, sadness, fear, guilt, grief, the amygdala interprets it as a threat. The rational brain loses control and the emotional brain takes the wheel. But instead of expressing the feeling directly, the mind spirals. It analyzes, it loops, it replays conversations, it plans for every worst-case scenario. Why? Because it would rather overthink endlessly than sit with the rawness of what's real. That's why so many people live in their heads. It's safer than feeling. But this emotional overload becomes cognitive clutter. The brain can only carry so much before it starts short-circuiting, like a computer with too many programs open. You forget things. You lose focus. You feel paralyzed in decision-making. This isn't a character flaw. It's a survival response. Your brain is trying to stay ahead of the emotional storm it never learned how to weather. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, offers a path out through awareness, labeling, and physiological release. The first step is to interrupt the cycle of abstract thought and bring your attention to your body. Where does anxiety live? Your chest, your gut, your throat. Emotions aren't just mental, they're somatic. They're sensations looking for movement, and if they don't move through you, they will speak against you. Instead of spiraling through questions like, "Why am I like this?" or "What if something goes wrong?" ask, "What am I avoiding feeling right now?" That question alone can dismantle hours of mental noise. It shifts you from mental escape to emotional presence, the very act your brain is starving for. Practical tools include emotional journaling, not about events, but about sensations. Today I felt heavy. I noticed tightness when I heard that voice. This anchors your awareness in reality instead of rumination. Breath work is also essential. Deep diaphragmatic breathing, or the physiological sigh described by Andrew Huberman, reactivates the parasympathetic nervous system and lowers the amygdala's grip. Movement matters too. Walking, stretching, even dancing. Any rhythm that lets the body speak what the brain won't say. Philosophically, the Stoics taught that emotion is not the enemy of reason. It's the shadow that reveals it. Marcus Aurelius journaled not to suppress his feelings, but to understand and master them. Descartes, too, believed that understanding begins with doubt, and doubt begins with listening. Joe Dispenza's work reminds us that emotions are memorized patterns. When we feel the same feelings repeatedly without resolution, we condition our brains to expect more of the same. But when we consciously interrupt the pattern with emotional clarity, we begin to rewire the response. We free the mind by honoring the heart. To quiet an overthinking brain, you don't need more thoughts. You need fewer suppressed feelings. When the emotional backlog is cleared, the mind no longer has to scream for attention. It relaxes, it listens, it breathes. The light-dark rhythm, resetting the biological clock for mental recovery. Your brain isn't just overthinking, it's out of rhythm. And the rhythm it's lost isn't philosophical or metaphorical, it's biological. Just like your heart follows a beat, your brain follows a cycle. A light-dark rhythm hardwired by evolution to govern focus, rest, and emotional regulation. But in the modern world, this natural rhythm has been hijacked by artificial light, overstimulation, and disconnection from the sun that once told our ancestors when to act and when to stop. Andrew Huberman has shown in his research that light is the strongest anchor for your circadian rhythm. That rhythm doesn't just affect sleep. It dictates the release of neurotransmitters like dopamine, serotonin, and melatonin, the chemical trio responsible for motivation, balance, and rest. When you wake up and expose your eyes to natural sunlight within the first hour, you trigger a cascade of signals to the brain. It's time to be alert. Cortisol rises, but in a healthy way. It prepares your mind for action. Dopamine gets released, enhancing mood and drive. This is how you begin the day with clarity. But most people delay this activation. They check their phones in the dark, scroll under LED lights, avoid the sun, and then wonder why their minds are foggy by noon and anxious by night. Their internal clocks are stuck in a perpetual twilight, never fully on, never fully off. Then comes the second mistake. At night, we blast our eyes with blue light from screens. The brain sees that light and says, "Daytime again?" Melatonin gets suppressed. Sleep is delayed. The brain remains in gear even when the body is exhausted. Over time, this disconnect leads to a phenomenon called social jet lag, when your circadian rhythm is completely misaligned with your environment. It's one of the silent drivers of anxiety, overthinking, and emotional dysregulation. You're tired but wired, awake but unfocused. Fixing this doesn't require a complete lifestyle overhaul. It requires precision exposure. 10 minutes of early morning sunlight, even through clouds, is enough to synchronize your internal clock. At night, dimming your lights 2 hours before bed, limiting screens, and allowing the mind to descend into quiet sends the opposite message. The day is ending. You can let go. This natural light-dark contrast resets your brain's operating system. Joe Dispenza speaks of aligning your biology with your intention. This starts with respecting the rhythms that biology depends on. Because when your circadian system is balanced, your thoughts begin to follow a gentler rhythm too. You stop feeling like your mind is racing against time. You start living inside time again. Philosophically, Aristotle taught that harmony, eudaimonia, comes not from constant doing but from balance. The Stoics lived by the sun and moon, understanding that discipline is not about intensity, but about rhythm. Descartes, too, believed that clarity emerges in silence. But silence must be invited, not forced. The truth is, your overthinking may not be a psychological issue at all. It may be a lighting issue, a timing issue, a rhythm issue. When you live in defiance of nature's clock, your mind becomes your enemy. When you return to that rhythm, it becomes your ally. The Stoic reset, reframing thought itself. It's not your thoughts that torment you, it's your relationship with them. This is where the transformation begins, not by adding more techniques or routines, but by shifting the fundamental way you interact with your mind. You've been trying to stop your thoughts, to wrestle them into silence, to outthink your overthinking. But what if peace doesn't come by suppression, only by observation? The Stoics understood this long before neuroscience confirmed it. Marcus Aurelius wrote, You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. He wasn't speaking of control through force, but control through perspective. Thought is not reality, it is a lens. And when you forget this, your own mind becomes a cage. Cognitive behavioral therapy teaches a similar truth. Your brain creates automatic thoughts based on old emotional patterns. These thoughts feel urgent, true, overwhelming, but they are often distorted echoes of past experiences. The problem isn't that you think too much. The problem is that you believe every thought that appears. Here is where we apply the Stoic reset, not to change your thoughts, but to change your stance toward them, to begin seeing them as mental weather, passing clouds, not permanent truths. As Descartes would suggest, if you can question the thought, you are already not the thought. There is a you before thought, and you can access it always. When you learn to observe thought like a philosopher dissects an argument, your mind loses its grip. When you stop identifying with every anxious prediction, every internal criticism, every loop of guilt or anticipation, your brain begins to unwind. It breathes again. You begin to feel the quiet distance between what your mind says and what you choose to believe. Jordan Peterson speaks of the necessity of precision. Be precise in your perception of thought. Don't label it me. Label it pattern. Don't say I am overwhelmed. Say, there is a thought of overwhelm. This small change reclaims your freedom. You are no longer the slave of inner dialogue. You become its observer, its editor, its master. Neuroscience now backs this with clarity. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of reasoning, activates differently when you label thoughts as mental events, rather than absolute truths. This act of reframing is not just philosophical, it's physiological. It changes your brain, and once you master this, a new kind of stillness becomes available. Not a silence born of emptiness, but of presence. Not the quiet that comes from escaping thought, but the peace that comes from standing beside it, untouched. This is the Stoic reset. The power to face your thoughts without flinching. To say, you may arise, but you do not rule me. That is the beginning of mental sovereignty. That is the foundation of true rest. How to let the brain breathe again. Stillness is not silence. It is the sacred pause beneath all noise, the space where your mind finally exhales. And yet, for most people today, that space feels terrifying. We mistake it for emptiness, for weakness, for boredom. But it is in that very stillness that the brain remembers what it means to be whole. Think of this. Your brain was never designed to run at full speed all day, absorbing stimuli, replaying fears, forecasting futures. It evolved to rest, to wander, to observe without urgency. But we trained it otherwise. We addicted it to stimulation, rewired it to confuse rest with uselessness, and taught it that unless it's producing something, it's failing. That lie has cost us our clarity, our focus, and our peace. Now it's time to unlearn. True rest is not a nap. It's not a weekend off. It's a deep physiological recalibration, a return to balance between sympathetic drive and parasympathetic restoration. Andrew Huberman's research confirms that mental recovery isn't passive. It's an active biological state where GABA rises, cortisol lowers, and your neural networks reorganize the fragments of your mind into integration. But here's the paradox. To enter this state, you must stop chasing it. You must stop trying to force calm. Instead, you allow it. You allow thought to pass without gripping it. You allow the body to relax without commanding it. You create space between stimulus and reaction, between narrative and awareness. And in that space, the brain breathes again. Joe Dispenza calls it the moment where mind and body begin to separate, where you become the observer of your own patterns instead of their prisoner. It's not transcendence, it's return. Return to a natural state of coherence, where your heart and brain fall into rhythm, and your nervous system no longer fights itself. This is not new. Descartes hinted at it in his Meditations, when he stripped away every belief, every thought, until all that remained was awareness itself. "I think, therefore I am" was never a call to overanalyze. It was a reminder that your awareness of thought is what proves your existence, not the thought itself. The stillness between thoughts is where your essence resides. Stillness is not an escape. It's not a luxury. It is a form of preparation, the sharpening of your mental blade. Just as a warrior polishes his sword before the battle, you must polish your awareness before re-entering the chaos. Not to withdraw from life, but to meet it with precision and grace. When you relearn stillness, you stop being the mind's hostage. You become its leader. So take that pause. Let your brain breathe. Let the noise pass through you. And as it fades, you'll begin to feel it. The quiet pulse beneath the chaos. The presence that was always there, waiting to be remembered. That is not the end of your mind. That is its rebirth.